do you want, my champion?
The voices merged into a single titanic reverberation, through his bones and physical form, into the bounds of his turbulent and unquiet psyche.
I want to endure. Then rise,
the grandfather told him.
Rise as a prince born of death. Vengeance awaits you in the realm of men, and with it the blackest, most dire purpose, a slaughter, by which your name will be feared until the last human soul fades to entropy.
The Death Guard, the 14th Legion, the Sons of Barbarous. Formerly known as the Dusk Raiders when they were raised on Terra, they were renamed when they were reunited with their Primarch Mortarion from the Death World of Barbarous, located in the southern arm of the galaxy in the Segmentum Tempestus. The Death Guard are a traitor legion entirely steeped in the power of Nurgle, the god of death and plagues, their very essence the epitome of all that vile Chaos God stands for. Their bodies are hives of filth and decay, their flesh eternally rotting away even as it is renewed by the ceaseless process of death and rebirth. When the Horus Heresy plunged the galaxy into civil war, the warriors of the Death Guard found themselves becalmed in the warp on their way to the siege of Terra, and assailed by warp-born plagues so virulent that not even their legendary resilience could withstand them. Soon, the entire legion was beset by a sickness that bloated their bellies with corpse gas, caused flesh to slow from their bodies, and made their strongest and toughest warriors into crippled wretches assailed by delirium. Though none can say exactly what forces act upon the soul of the Primarch of the Death Guard, whether he was already damned or whether he made his pact in some state of fever, he called out for deliverance, and his call must have been answered. When the Death Guard Legion's fleet emerged from the warp, its vessels and its warriors were entirely changed. Worse still, the Plague Marines of the Death Guard were now hosts for the most virulent afflictions that their new patron, the Plague God Nurgle, could concoct. Condemned to a deathless state of eternal decay, the Death Guard would spread their pestilent diseases the length and breadth of the galaxy for the glory of chaos.
Hey guys, my name is Jim and welcome back to the channel. Today I am bringing you my long-awaited Death Guard painting video. I have been collecting Death Guard basically since the end of 8th edition and the start of 9th when I knew that their new codex was coming out, and I really wanted to build up a small force. So for today's tutorial we're going to be going through kind of a single Death Guard Space Marine, how I painted it from start to finish. I really like the background behind the Death Guard, especially if you've read The Buried Dagger by James Swallow. It tells the story of Mortarions basically fall to grace and their corruption by Nurgle, including their betrayal by Typhus and how that whole situation happened. So I would highly recommend checking out The Buried Dagger. I never used to traditionally like the Death Guard. I always thought the models were a little too dirty. And so for my scheme, I really wanted to do something that was a little bit different. And so with the scheme that we're going to be doing today, I went with basically a white armor scheme, which harkens back to their armor scheme during the Horus Heresy. And also I added a lot of green, a lot of brass to kind of bring them up to their current armor scheme. So the scheme that we're going to do today is kind of, for me, a little bit of a mix between their original 30k Horus Heresy scheme and their current green scheme. And it's kind of like a transitional scheme. So this is something where I like to do a very unique scheme for myself, and I wanted something that was very easy to paint. So as you guys will see through this tutorial, it's going to be really easy to paint. Alright, welcome to the first step of our Death Guard painting video. So for our very first step, we're going to be priming this model in black, which I've done beforehand, and then we're going to be doing a very smooth and consistent airbrush using Rakarth Flesh. Make sure to thin this out with your airbrush thinner about 1:1. You're going to want to do nice thin layers back and forth over the entire model. Make sure you get underneath all the gaps, inside all the recesses, and just basically a full solid coat. Alright, so once our model is dry and the base coat's dry, we're going to go in and do all of the trim with Decayed Metal from Scale 75. Now, Decayed Metal is one of my favorite colors. It has a really dark kind of bronze copper look. Make sure to thin this out a little bit. You don't want to be using it super thin, but be very careful on this step. We're going to be basically doing all the trim, rivets, bolts, those kinds of things. So just take your time here and work your way around the model. All right, so with the model all base coated, we're going to go in with our wash. So this is Algae Wash from Secret Weapon Miniatures. And what we're going to do here is thin this out with about a 50% of Lamian medium. And we're going to wash this all over the model using a very large brush. Now, with this, you want to make sure you start from the top, work your way around the model, making sure you're getting in all of the cracks, and basically just do the entire model from head to toe with this wash. Make sure you don't let too much of it pool in certain areas, but basically you can see here, I'm basically going super aggressive with it and going all over the model. So once this step is done, you're going to want to give it at least a good 15 to 20 minutes to dry fully, and then we'll get to the next step. All right, so with our model all dry, we're going to base coat all of the metal sections with our Thrash Metal from Scale 75. This is one of my favorite metals, and just like the Decayed Metal, make sure to thin it out a little bit. Be very careful. You don't want to try to oversplash too much, but thankfully it's not a big deal if we do, because we're going to have time to go back later and fix it. So just work around the model and make sure it's fully coated. With the Thrash Metal dry, it is now time to wash all our metal areas. And for this, we're going to be using Armour Wash from Secret Weapon. And for this, just 100% pure. Make sure to give the bottle a really good shake and go around and get all of the metal areas. Now again, don't worry if you get a little bit of oversplash. There's a method to this madness, and what we want to be doing in this step is base coating all of our areas and then giving it a wash, and that's going to give us what I call a base state model. So with the Armour Wash dry, we're going to move on to the purple areas, and for this we're going to base coat the model with Nagaroth Knight from Citadel. Make sure you thin this out a little bit and kind of go over all the purple areas. It's a pretty simple process. Not a lot to it, so just make sure to take your time. I kind of skipped ahead here because it is a little bit boring. And so for our next base coat, we're going to go over all the fleshy areas with Green by Pro Acryl. And we're going to do this on the tentacles, the guts, any areas where there's flesh, or any of the kind of sticky, gooey, organic bits. And I like to do this section next. The reason we like to do all this base coating right at the start is because with these Death Guard models, there are so many different little details. This actually really helps us to differentiate between the different types of textures. And once that's done, we're gonna basically go over all of our purple areas with Nuln Oil. And I'm using 100% Nuln Oil here, just straight from the pot. And I've just sped up this section just so you guys can kind of see what I'm up to. And this is getting us to that base state model that I mentioned earlier. I've also gone ahead and washed all the green areas with BL Tan Green. And now we're going to start our armor highlight. So for this, I'm using Rekarth Flesh, and I've thinned it out quite a bit. And it's really important that for this technique, we're basically doing a kind of striation pattern. So you can notice here, I'm using very thin paint, and I'm basically pulling it down very roughly, trying to create some texture in the armor. I'm not doing a solid coat. Basically, I'm pulling always in the same direction with my brush using a thin tip. And I'm going to repeat this process as I highlight the model. And every time I'm going to kind of highlight it like I would traditionally highlight it, but I'm actually creating some striations here, some texture in the armor. So now our Rekarth Flesh is complete, and we're going to go in with 50% Rekarth Flesh and some bright warm gray. And for this, same thing, we're going to basically do these nice little striations, making sure to get the areas that we would traditionally highlight, and just pulling with our brush. And one of the great things about this technique is you can be really, really kind of rough with it. You don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be fully coated. You actually want some of that green showing from underneath. And we're going to kind of continue this process all over the model. So with our Rekarth Flesh 50% with Bright Warm Gray complete, we're going to go in with pure Bright Warm Gray. And we're basically just going to catch the very edges of the armor here, very tips of the surfaces, anywhere where there's maybe a sharper point. It's essentially the equivalent of an edge highlight, but obviously we're not edge highlighting. We're again continuing this kind of very rough striation pattern where I basically just pull the brush towards one direction, and we're always going to be leaving a little bit of that previous color underneath so that you can see the different shades. So here we are, our white armor is complete. And now we're going to go in with a little bit of Corvus Black and basically base coat all of the tubes, any of the cables. We're going to base coat the plasma gun here, the handle of the gun, anything that we basically missed in the previous steps. All right, now we're on to our first highlight for our green. So we're going to go in with our base coat green, and we're basically going to hit up all the areas, just the tops of the surfaces. Again, just a very basic highlight here. This is basically leaving a little bit of that dark shade into the corners. Now we're going in with a 50% mix of our green color with a little bit of golden yellow from Pro Acryl, and this is going to help brighten it up. And we're going to continue this process, adding a little bit more yellow each time, and obviously touching a little bit less of the green areas and the skin areas, just so that it's as bright as we want. And at the very end, we're going to just do a little bit of a touch of that golden yellow. And you can go as bright as you want on this step. I like to go right up to that nice, super bright golden yellow. That really helps these flesh areas pop. You can see here how bright it is, and it really just helps the flesh area stand out against a very kind of monotone and neutral model. So it's something that I definitely like to do, go as bright as possible here. All right, with our green sections complete, we're going to start highlighting our purple. So we're going to go in with our Naggaroth Night base coat. And again, just like we did on the green, we're going to basically cover off about 90% of that base color, leaving a little bit of that really dark Nuln Oil in the recesses and in the crevasses, and basically doing a first highlight. You can see here I'm being very careful to grab just the edges of the straps, any of the other little purple areas. Just take your time here and use a very thin brush. Now we're going to go in with our Naggaroth Night 50% and 50% bright warm gray. I like to use the gray as a highlight color because it really helps kind of keep the purple not too saturated. And you can see here I'm just carefully going in and highlighting those areas. All right, you can notice here I'm actually going back and correcting a little bit of a mistake I made. So I ended up adding a little bit too much bright warm gray to my purple, and I noticed that the difference between the base coat and my highlight was quite stark. So what I did was I kind of created a mid-tone and I just glazed it into that transition area. And sometimes this happens. It's just part of painting. You make little mistakes, and it's really easy to go back and fix them rather than having to repaint the whole area. And here I'm doing my final highlight, about a 75% mix of bright warm gray with a little bit of that Naggaroth Night. So you can go as bright as you want. For my purples on my Death Guard, I like to keep them a little bit more muted though. And again, just be really careful using a really fine detail brush. Carefully go around. Make sure to get the very, very edges of those straps. Any of the cloth or anything like that I like to get as well. This is kind of the main color for my cloth areas. All right, so now I'm going and painting in some Corvus Black with a little bit of titanium white in it. And this is just basically a slightly brighter version of Corvus Black. A highlight color, and I'm going to do that on all the gray areas, the cables, anything where it's supposed to be black. And I'm going to continue this process, adding a little bit of white each time until I've reached kind of my ideal highlight color. So I'm probably going to do this about 2 or 3 times, making sure that I'm adding a little bit more white each time, making sure that I'm getting the edge highlights, highlighting just the very tips of the edges, and continuing this process 1 or 2 more times until I'm happy with the color of the gray. All right, so with my gray all highlighted, I'm gonna go back and basically wash all of those black gray areas with Nuln Oil. And what this is gonna allow me to do is really tie in those highlights, really merge them together and kind of tone down a little bit of the gray, because I do want it to be black after all. And if you go a little bit too much gray, you can add in that Nuln Oil. Now I'm going to be basically painting the plasma coils in white. So anytime you're doing plasma, best thing to do is to start with white. Just take your time working around the model, making sure it is nice and neat. And with the white all dry, I'm going to go in with a very pink mix here of about 80% white with a little bit of Naggaroth Night in it. And this is going to give me kind of a bright pink color. And you'll notice here, I'm basically just painting the tops of the plasma coils and using a very thin paint, leaving that white at the very bottom of the plasma coils. And I'm just gonna be very careful continuing this process around the model until I've got all of that pink on the top areas of the plasma nacelles, or whatever you want to call them. Now I'm going to add a little bit more Nigroth and basically continue this process. And each time I do this, I'm going to paint a little bit higher up on that coil towards the top. So the plasma coil is going to be nice and hot near the bottom. That's where I'm going to want the white. Whereas the top of the plasma coil is going to be a lot cooler. So I'm going to paint that in a darker purple color. And I'm basically going to continue this process 2 or 3 times until I'm almost back to my Nigroth. You can see here the color is getting darker and darker as I go up, and you're just going to continue this process. Now at this point, don't worry too much about if you get some of that color inside the ridges in between the plasma coil. We're going to go back with a brighter color and actually fix this step later on. So you'll notice here I'm now going in with a little bit of very thin Nigroth, and I'm painting just very carefully the very tops of the coils to give that nice kind of dark finish. So again, just take your time here, being really careful using a very thin brush, and make sure your paints are nice and thin. All right, now that I've done all of that, I'm gonna go in with a very thinned out, you can see I put it on my thumb there, super thin white pink mix. So this is probably around 90% white with a little bit of purple in there. And I'm going to use that very thin mix to actually paint in between those coils. So this is where I'm going to kind of go fix those coils. And then after that's done, I'm going to go in with a little bit of my Corvus black and gray mix and just kind of fix any areas where there was overspill. So make sure you do this step. It's especially important. All right, so now it's time to kind of do my first highlight on the armor areas. And I'm just going in with my thrash metal and just doing a very, very light, almost a wet brush on the metal areas. I don't want to go too crazy on this highlight, and I want to keep the metal kind of pretty dark. So I'm just doing a very light little highlight on the metal areas. All right, eyes, everyone's favorite thing to do. So first I'm going to start with a little bit of Galvor Back Red from Citadel. Then I'm going to go in with a little bit of Evil Sun Scarlet into the middle, and adding to that a little bit of golden yellow from Pro Aquarel to get the eyes nice and bright. So again, with eyes, just take your time, do this as slow as you can, using the smallest brush you can. If you make a mistake, which I definitely did when I was doing this, don't worry about it. Get the eye perfect, and then you can go back and kind of fix and correct any of the areas around the eye. So if you get a little bit of red on the cheek or on areas that it shouldn't be, you can go in with other colors and fix those areas. All right, so now it's time to paint the plague weapons. And for this, I'm using Sewer Water from Secret Weapon. I'm gonna do that kind of on the main area of the blade. And then I'm gonna go in with a little bit of my algae mix from Secret Weapon as well while it's still wet, and kind of wet blend those together on the blade. And this is gonna give the blade a nice kind of green, brown, gross little color, and it's gonna represent plague weapons. Moving on to the horns. So I'm going to base coat all of the horns with ivory from Pro Aquarel, and just go in with it very carefully and base coat that area. Make sure you give it lots of time to dry. All right, with the ivory all dry, I'm going to go in with some Agrax Earthshade. This is also by Citadel. And I'm going to use pure Agrax Earthshade out of the pot and basically wash the whole area, making sure that I get it right up to the edge and let lots of that Agrax Earthshade settle into the crevasses. I want to give this a good 5 or 10 minutes to dry before I move on to the next step. All right, for my next step, I'm going to take a little bit of Agrax Earthshade and mix it with a little touch of black. And I'm going to basically paint up about 70% up the top of the blade. And I'm basically going to continue this process, adding a little bit of black every time until we get almost a pure black at the top. So on this step here, I'm adding about a 50% mix of black and Agrax Earthshade, about 50% up the bone. And it's really important here that you let this dry in between each step. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a kind of muddy mess. Now I'm going to go in for that final highlight of basically almost pure black and Agrax Earthshade right on the tip. And this is going to give that bone a nice little transition from a kind of lighter color towards the base towards a nice dark tip at the top. All right, so we're almost at the home stretch. So now I'm gonna go in with my decayed metal and basically start highlighting all the trim. And I like to leave this step for the very end, just because I often end up handling these miniatures and roughing them up, and I find the trim is usually what bears the brunt of that. So I like to use the trim at the very end so that if there is any that rubbed off, I can go back and fix it. Once that first layer of decayed metal is dry, I'm gonna go in with a 50% mix of decayed metal and thrash metal. And basically this is gonna be my highlight color, and I'm just gonna do one highlight because again, I wanna keep that metal nice and dark. Using a nice thin brush, working my way around the model, hitting just the tips of those edges, and finishing off all the metal. Now for the final step, I'm gonna be basically doing the messy and gross kind of pus. So for this, I'm using Casandora Yellow, thinned about 50% with water. And at this step, it's just kind of paint as you go and kind of figure out where you want. So for this, I generally paint it into all the cracks, have it kind of running down from anywhere where there's basically bone sticking through, along armor edges, anywhere where there's like holes in the armor. Ultimately, you can kind of do as little or as much as you want, but it's a nice accent color. Now, once this is done, we're gonna base our model and we're all ready to go. Next up, a completed Death Guard Space Marine. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. As always, if you did enjoy the content, please make sure to hit that thumbs up, leave a like and comment below, subscribe to the channel, and we're gonna basically do a lot more content, including battle reports. Obviously, I'm doing 2 or 3 podcasts a week on all sorts of topics. Make sure to join the channel on Twitch and on YouTube, and you guys can get access to all sorts of other perks. We also have a Discord channel now, so feel free to join that. And with that said, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you soon.